Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. So beyond the debacle of Dieppe, the other battle that came to define the Canadian experience in World War II was the intense urban combat of Ortona in Italy. Anthropologist Ian Cosh joins me to discuss its legacy with both military people who survived it, civilians who witnessed it. His book, Ghosts of Ortona, here's my copy here, is of course in the description below, or you can find it whenever you get your books. It'll be one of those ones that's hard to place on your bookshelf. Do you put it with the battles? Do you kind of put it with the thinking back towards World War II? That's why it's here, because it's a complicated, nuanced subject. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Ian. How are you today?
Hi, great. Thanks. How are you, Paul?
I'm good. So I just kind of hinted at it there, anthropologist, and it's you're not just retelling the story of the battle. It's the whole deeper impact on everybody who was through it, the town rebuilding itself out of the ashes. So for those who perhaps are less familiar with what an anthropologist is compared to a conventional military historian, give us a little bit about yourself before we bring up your slides.
Okay, sure. Gosh, anthropology is such a broad field of study. Sometimes it's a little hard to just say simply what it is, but a key point in anthropology is the method of participant observation. So we try to meet people where they are, so to speak. And when we study historical events, we're mainly interested in how those events are remembered or the aftermath of the events. Now, I also do have a background in history. I studied history as an undergraduate. And so in my research, I kind of combine the two approaches. And when we get to some of my slides, I'm prepared to say a bit more about how anthropologists and also oral historians approach topics of history and memory.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll bring up a slide. So folks, I don't know how many questions you'll have because there's going to be lots of themes coming up in the discussion, but doesn't mean we don't welcome them. But I think let the presentation develop a bit before you kind of fire them at me rapid fire. But I'm going to hand over to Ian to take us through this. And I said to him before going live, I love these popular memory shows. We've done them on the Battle of Britain and Stalingrad and Tobruk, and they always leave me thinking, and that's always good. When I go away from a presentation going, that's always good for me. So Ian, start the ball rolling.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I'll also just say that I'm always interested in new questions and new perspectives. And so I never consider my work to be like the last word on any subject. So I'll be really interested in questions as they come up. And also after the presentation, if people want to contact me with more questions or maybe perspectives on some of the subjects that I didn't mention, you've got my website there. And I'm always happy to hear from people and to think more on these topics myself. Now, what I thought I would do today is begin with a brief introduction to my research. And as I said, I'll say a bit about how oral historians and anthropologists like myself approach memory and history with a few illustrations from Ortona. And then I'll give an overview of the battle. Now, it won't be like a deeply detailed history of the Battle of Ortona, but just an overview to orient us. I assume that many people have already heard of Ortona, but I don't want to assume too much. Then in part 3, I'll talk about the battle in Canadian popular memory and how it went from relative obscurity. Like when I started my research, I hadn't heard of Ortona. That was in the late 1990s, and I'm someone who studied Canadian history and who was actively interested in Canadian war remembrance. So it really was quite unknown, unlike Dieppe, like you mentioned, Paul. Dieppe was the more famous battle at that time. So how Ortona went from that relative obscurity to prominence, where it's now a real sort of touchstone of Canadian memory of World War II. And then finally, in part 4, I'm going to say more about there's a monument in Ortona called the Price of Peace. And I'm going to tell the mostly forgotten story of how that monument came to be and the meanings that it had for the people who inspired it. So that's the overview. And now here, on the left there, that's a painting by a Canadian war artist, Charles Comfort, Lauren Harris. another war artist who was at Ortona named Lauren Harris, and that's called Coast Road Before Ortona. And that Ortona was fought in December, last week of December 1943. In the middle there you see me in Ortona in 1998. That was December 1998. And that's at the Morrow River Canadian War Cemetery. And at that time, I was a PhD student in anthropology, just starting my project. And I was interested in how, I started out with an interest in how Canadian veterans remembered the battle. And I expanded to an interest in how Italian civilians, the civilian survivors of the battle, how they remembered it. I was also interested in how the Germans remembered the battle, but that became a little too much for me to do all in one PhD project. I did manage to interview a couple of Germans, and that's also in my book. But the majority of my work was with Canadian veterans of Ortona and Italian civilians. And so that my fieldwork was 1998 to 2000. It's a long time ago now. And it also took me a long time to finish my PhD. That's not uncommon among anthropologists. Because of the nature of our fieldwork, often we have to learn new languages, we go to new places. It takes a long time, the logistics of the work, and a long time to interpret the work. In my case, I probably did too much research for, if the purpose was just to get a PhD in anthropology. I got a bit carried away. I tell a bit more of the story of that in my book. I won't go into that here. Basically, I finished my PhD finally in 2014. By the time I was done, I needed a break from the topic. I found work outside of academia. And around 2023, I started returning to think about the subject and thinking that I really ought to write a book from that. And I did some new research for the book. So the book is a combination of the research that I did 98 to 2000 and new research that I did starting in 2023. And that's how I get to be here today. Now, in the photograph here, you see some of the veterans who I interviewed. That's Alan Johnson these are all veterans of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment who fought in the urban battle of Ortona. And that's a photo of them taking a photo of themselves at the Morrow River Canadian War Cemetery, the same time that I was there in 98. And I'll just say from left to right, there's Alan Johnson, Mel McPhee, Joe Turion, Bill Teleski, and Sam Lenko. And Alan, Mel, and Sam all make significant appearances in my book. And I put behind that a page of the war diary from the Seaforth Highlanders, who were also in the urban battle of Ortona. And that's just a slide to illustrate that I did a combination of oral history interviews with the veterans and archival research. And before I move on from that, I just thought it would be neat to share with you a little detail in that war diary. And I don't think we can zoom in on it, but if you look at the date, if you're able to see the date there next to in the field, Italy, it actually says December 1944. Now, the battle, this was taking place in December 1943. And so what happened was, just at the start of the battle, when the Seaforth Battalion headquarters was coming under bombardment, the next entry that the war diarist wrote, he put 44 by mistake instead of 43. He continued writing the date for the rest of the week. I mean, and then he got into January 1st and it wasn't a mistake anymore. But those are the sort of little things that I love finding in the archive, where it gives you a sense of the real people and the moments that were happening in the midst of these documents being created. And I also, like I mentioned, did interviews with Italians, with civilians in Ortona. On the left, that's a photograph of the groundskeeper of the cemetery at the time that I was there in 98, 99, named Franco. On the right is, I don't think it exists anymore, but it's a periodical from Ortona called La Piazza. And I spent, I made 2 trips to Ortona and spent a total of about 4 months there at that time, interviewing people who were, who experienced the battle. Some of them experienced it obviously as small children, so there was a variety of ages of people that I got to talk to there. Now, I thought I would show people where Ortona is in case you don't know already. And you might be wondering what's going on in this picture. And so, Paul, I wonder if you can guess, or if you want to see if anyone in the audience can take a guess. Why do we have a map of Italy with a menu superimposed over it?
Well, I'm not going to, because I have read that bit of the book, so I don't want to spoil it. I'll let you explain.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by just telling us where Ortona is to give people time to take a guess. Under, if you look at nuts and raisins, vegetable soup, Ortona's right under the soup.
Yeah, yeah.
And to give you an idea of where that is in Italy, Rome is there under the veg of vegetable soup. And the map is marked, it's just not just an ordinary map of Italy, it's actually a map of the Italian campaign from the Canadian Army point of view. And that's right, I see Norman Graham, the Christmas dinner and Ortona menu. Yeah.
Yeah, they will know, they're good people.
Yeah. You've heard of the famous Christmas dinner in Ortona, which was organized by the Seaforth Highlanders of Vancouver in a church, which was at the same time their battalion headquarters. What is it, like they're just like 400 yards, 500 yards from the front at the time on Christmas Day. And sometime after the war, the Seaforth Highlanders started commemorating that dinner. And so this map that I have is taken from their menu card, Men's Annual Ortona. I don't think it's called Men's Annual Ortona Dinner anymore, but in 1998, that's what it was. And what you see on the right is a photograph that's often used to represent that dinner. In fact, certainly in Canada, maybe internationally, that's probably the most common photograph that's used if there's a story, an article in a newspaper about the Battle of Ortona. Often around Christmas time, it's remembered by some article in the media, and that's the photo that's used to represent the dinner. Now, there's some controversy around that photograph. And I'll use that just to say a little bit about memory and history as well. So that photograph. So when I was actually in Ortona and that photograph was circulating, it was in some books that were produced in Ortona itself, some photo collections of the battle. And I remembered some of the veterans who were there at the time. They pointed out to me that photograph in the book is not actually of the Seaforth's dinner. It might have been some of the Seaforth veterans themselves who told me, I can't remember. They said, no, that was actually, that was a separate Christmas dinner that they had in the brigade headquarters in San Vito, which is about, I don't know, 5 kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers, just down the coast from Ortona. Now, then, some years ago, in some museums and some articles in Canada, people began reporting that actually we have evidence that this was the photograph, and that one part of the dinner that they had at the church was in a courtyard outside the church. And coinciding with that, there was a veteran who identified himself in the photo. He said, that's me. I can see myself in that picture. So then it came reported that we can now reassure ourselves that that is the Seaforth's dinner. Now, further research was done on the photograph, and my source for this, there's an article online which I placed at the bottom of the slide. By the way, my sources for various things, especially some of the books that I'm going to mention, I'll post all of that on my Substack.
Okay.
Within a few days, and that'll be shared on my website as well. So I don't have sources for on the slides for most of these things because I didn't want to clutter them up. But people can always find that by going to my Substack. But for this one, I want to give credit to Ben Mook of the Canadian Film and Photo Unit website. And I also talked to the curator of the Seaforth Highlanders Museum. And he said that he had found the same thing through his own research, that when you go to the National Archives in Ottawa, you can find the photo reel of the Canadian Army photographer named Terry Rowe who took these pictures. And you can also find his notes. And his notes say that he was at San Vito Marina. And you can see what came before and what came after that famous photo of the dinner. And in one of those, you can see from another angle, the center picture there, it says Cafe e Vino. So that can't be a church. Now, there's other, if you go to Ben's article, he writes about some other things, but he goes into quite some detail about the geography, the layout of things, and so on. And what's interesting about this is that there was a veteran who identified himself in the photo and also said that he remembers eating that dinner outside in a courtyard. But the thing is that if his memory of that is accurate, then he either wasn't in the Battle of Ortona on that day, right? Or he's mixed together memories of different events so that he perhaps really did have a dinner like that outside at some point in Italy. And in his memory, that became connected to Ortona. Now, also how he recognizes himself in the picture. These are questions of how any of us recognize ourselves in old photographs, and how does memory work? So that's that remains a controversy. I can say, for my part, I'm reasonably convinced that that photograph is from San Vito, and the veteran who identified himself in it was making a mistake in his memory, basically,
yep.
or his identification. Now, that raises other questions about, like, what do we do with personal memories and with historical facts, or working with historical archives, that obviously individuals' memories can be mistaken. And of course, there can also be mistakes or even deliberate falsifications in archival material too. And so I just thought I would share this statement from one of the most prominent oral historians in recent decades, named Alessandro Portelli, from his book, The Death of Luigi Trastulli, where he says that oral history, the diversity of oral history consists in the fact that wrong statements are still psychologically true, and this truth may be equally as important as factually reliable accounts. What Portelli is saying there is that, like, for example, from my point of view, if I could have interviewed that veteran who identified himself in the photo, of course it would have been relevant to me to look at the sorts of evidence that Ben Mook and the museum curator found in the archives. It would be interesting to me that veteran misidentified himself, but it would be equally interesting to me that he felt it was important to see himself in that photo, or what did it mean to him that he's in that photo? What did that photograph mean to him? And what does that tell me about what Ortona meant to him, the way that he remembers Ortona? There were veterans that I interviewed who made some similar kinds of mistakes, or even where I can't say for sure that it was a mistake, there are discrepancies, right? And for an oral historian or an anthropologist, what we're at least equally, if not more, interested in is just what those memories and what those stories mean to the person who's telling them. So when someone like Portelli says that wrong statements are still psychologically true, it doesn't mean that we're not interested in the historical truth or what really happened. Like Portelli has done a lot of research on Nazi war crimes in Italy, like the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome. He's not indifferent to finding out which stories are more accurate than others, right? So it's not to discount the value or the importance of finding out as best as we can what really happened. It's just to make the point that that memory, even when has discrepancies, even when has internal inconsistencies, is very interesting and meaningful.
Yeah.
And one way I can illustrate that from my own research, first of all, this is another very famous image from the urban battle of Ortona on the left. Well, both on the left and the right. On the left, it's a photograph of the Ortona's Cathedral of San Tommaso, which was basically cut in half. There's some argument who's responsible for that. Did the Canadians bomb it? Did the Germans? Most of the stories that I heard from Italians were that the Germans blew it up by mistake or just out of recklessness, because the Germans wanted to destroy a tower which was right next to it. And the tower came down and took the dome down with it. That's, in any case, that's another story. And nowadays, I'm not sure how many people really worry about whether it was the Canadians. The Canadians certainly dropped a lot of bombs on Ortona. But the sort of common view in Ortona is that the Germans brought that down. In any case,
just to interrupt for a second, Ian, we have a church in San Lo just down the road, and those who've done the World War II TV tour will have been there with me to there. And there's still an artillery shell embedded in the wall of the church that is sort of locally known as the German shell, but it's from the north, which means it's categorically an American shell, because it was coming from the American lines, and we know that from the markings on it. But it's weird that the collective memory has kind of attributed it to the baddie.
Yeah.
Even though the Allies were technically the ones dropping more bombs on San Lo, but it's the way the town have, and this is exactly what you're saying, have adjusted the memory to the memory that suits them the best. Even though it's factually wrong, but it's emotionally how they want to tell it.
Yeah, that's a really great illustration of that. Yeah, because I had the sense, maybe if somebody who wasn't Canadian went to Ortona and asked around, would they have heard maybe some other perspectives, right? And I noticed that in some of the civilian stories of some very, very tragic, traumatic stories of. I have a slide where I briefly quote from her later on here. Luisa De Luzio tells the story of her father being shot dead during the battle. Now, she didn't see it happen, but it was because he got too close to a window during the urban fighting. And she just talked about it exclusively as the German who shot my father. And I always wondered, I didn't think to ask her at the time, and it's maybe not the sort of question that you always want to ask somebody. But I don't know how would she know that it was a German bullet that killed her father. In my mind, it could equally have been, like, veterans of Ortona told me that they spent a lot of time shooting at windows, and they were not looking at anybody in the window. They were just shooting at windows, and they were not expecting civilians to be there. So I think it could just as easily have been a Canadian who shot her father. Absolutely not on purpose. But yeah, that's another example of how, that's not even a question. Well, I suppose it's a question of memory, but it's a question of storytelling. Like, she didn't even witness it happen, but she talked like she knew. It was a German who shot her father. So, and also on the point of memory and this kind of creativity and interpretive work of our minds when we remember things. We can illustrate that with these two images, because on the left is a photo of the church. On the right is a painting by Canadian war artist Charles Comfort. The painting's called Via Dolorosa, Ortona. There's no street called Via Dolorosa in Ortona. That's a reference to the street in Jerusalem from Jesus walking to carrying his cross to the crucifixion. And so, of course, the title of the painting is an interpretation, and the painting itself is an interpretation of a street scene in Ortona with San Tommaso at the end of the street. And I can't find any street in Ortona that gives you such a view of San Tommaso. So that's interpretive work by the artist as well, to create a street scene, and that the Canadians are fighting towards and actually shooting towards the ruined cathedral. In the bottom foreground, you can just make out, it actually took me, it was a few years before I even noticed that there are Canadian soldiers in this painting. They're the same color as the rubble in the lower foreground. And they're shooting towards, or you can almost say at, the church. Now, and so I would, well, I'm not, it's not my original idea. It's been said by oral historians and anthropologists and by psychologists as well, that when we remember events, the way that our minds work, it's always an interpretation. And we condense, sometimes we bring details in from other experiences, from other moments, and we remember that as if that was part of the moment that we're remembering. It's a simplification of events and an interpretation. So just like the war artist did, Charles Comfort, and that was Charles Comfort's job, was to interpret. Otherwise, we could have just had photographers, right? And so our minds work the same way. It's not just war veterans. It's not age related. We all do this.
And we kind of, when we remember something, we're almost remembering the last version we told it rather than the original memory, don't we? We're like playing a recording of a recording. It's like the old VHS copy of a copy of a copy. And I've had fantastic conversations about how memory works so people understand it. It makes my brain hurt, but it's, it's not like pressing a digital play on a high definition recording. It's a fluid, ongoing kind of process, isn't it?
Exactly. And the more times that we tell a story of an experience, the more that it can get, that version of the story can get more ingrained. It can become then harder for us to remember aspects of our experience that were not part of the story that we're used to telling. And also, if we've never told a story at all about some experience that we've had, then that's apparent in the way that we tell the story, especially traumatic experiences, which understandably people are often reluctant to share, maybe never share, or don't share until years or decades after the event. Part of the difficulty of telling a story about such experiences is figuring out how to tell it, there were moments in some of my interviews where I felt that I was witnessing a veteran in the act of constructing the story, putting the pieces together, where it was, actually I have more to say about that in a slide just coming up. Here on the left is another photograph from the battle, and that's the building in the center there is the municipal building of Ortona. And the Germans, who, by the way, were the first parachute division, they had a machine gun post in what was the clock tower. You can see the little circle at the top of the building there. And they had created, by blowing apart adjacent buildings across the street. They created rubble piles. They created what they called killing zones that they hoped to channel the Canadians into. And one of obviously that photo was taken after that square had been cleared and made room for the tanks. And that photo was actually taken on the day that the battle ended. That's why the men are walking rather comfortably there. But one of the veterans who I interviewed, Mel McPhee, when we were looking through some of these photos, he told me, and he said, and I remember lying right here on a rubble pile, like right where those guys are walking. I remember lying on a rubble pile and shooting up at the church tower. Now, I noticed after I interviewed him, when I was looking back at this, I thought, well, wait a minute. He said church tower, pointing at that, but that's not a church tower. That's a clock tower. That's the municipal building in Ortona. Now, but Mel looked at that photo and he told a story of shooting a church tower. So was he on a rubble pile in front of the municipal building? Was he on a rubble pile facing the church, like in the painting on the right? Maybe he was in both places. What matters is that Mel remembered shooting at the church. And it was important enough to him that it was a central part of a poem that he wrote late in his life about the battle that he titled just Ortona. And here are the two verses from that poem, where and in this poem, suddenly, just for this part, he switches his voice to addressing himself. Back then, as you lay on a huge rubble pile, with your rifle loaded and cocked, your sights on the dome of Ortona's church, overlooking the length of the block. San Tomaso the church was a sniper up there who could see every move that was made. Better not take any chances, my friend. And so the tower was sprayed. So what I think is important is that Mel, it's possible that Mel also shot at the church tower. But what's important is that he thought that he did, and he felt like he did. And there was something about that stayed with him, to the point that when he was in his 70s, he wrote a poem about it. And so what was he doing when sort of dwelling on that experience? I think he was thinking about what it meant to him shooting at a church. I won't go further into that. I sort of explore that question in my book, or it'll come up later in the presentation here. But that's just a sort of an illustration of where, a guy can be telling you a story, pointing at a photo, and maybe you can think, well, is he making a mistake in his story? Is he making a mistake in looking at the photo? But those mistakes can be very meaningful in terms of what he experienced and what that meant to him later in life.
Paul Reed, who sits and has a coffee in the cafe near the Sherman in the previous photo, says something wonderful. So Paul's fantastic World War I podcast. Mistaken testimony with veterans is as important as the things they got right, because there is often meaning behind it. And I think that's summing up what you've just said, that it's not getting it wrong. It's finding a means of processing it in a way to bring up something that's important for the veteran.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. Yeah, I like that line. And a very important influence in my work that I thought I'd share with you and your audience as well, in case people are interested in these sorts of questions. And some of you might know this book or this scholar already, Alistair Thompson. He's an Australian oral historian who wrote a book called Anzac Memories, Living with the Legend. And so the approach that I take and the things that I'm talking about here, including when I get to the relationships between veterans' personal memories or private memories in comparison or in relationship to public memory, social memory, Alistair Thompson did really groundbreaking work on that, interviewing Anzac veterans, so Australian World War I veterans. And a key quote that he has here from his book is, we compose or construct memories using the public languages and meanings of our culture. In another sense, we compose memories that help us to feel relatively comfortable with our lives and identities, that give us a feeling of composure. So he noticed a really useful dual meaning of the word compose or composure, right? We have like emotional composure, and we also talk about composing stories, composing narratives. He points out how we're always drawing on our culture and our language to help us interpret our experience and to help us tell stories. So for example, Mel, thinking about shooting at the church, and let's say for the sake of argument that he never actually shot at the church tower.
Yeah.
But he remembers shooting at the church tower, and that's how he tells his story. In a way, that's a way for him to communicate something about how he felt, maybe the troubles that he felt, the ambivalence he felt about some of the things that he did as a soldier in Ortona. And so he's drawing on meanings from his culture to remember and to share those meanings with others, so that he can understand himself and so that others can understand him. And at the same time, what people are often doing with stories is looking for ways to feel more settled, to feel more at peace with who we are, with what we remember, with our experiences, and with others. So those are all functions of stories that that oral historians and anthropologists like myself are always thinking about when we do this kind of work. And in terms of how personal memories, individual memories of veterans like Mel relate to public meanings, one of the important things to consider is the tradition of war remembrance. And this is just an image I thought was a good image to put up when I'm talking about Canadian tradition of war remembrance. And it's not uniquely Canadian, like, Remembrance Day, the poppy in Flanders Fields. One thing that's interesting about that actually is that it remains a kind of common language across the UK and the former British dominions. I know that in Australia, Anzac Day has become more significant, but still, even then, what I've seen of Anzac Day is that the forms, the rituals, the discourse, many of the symbols are still shared in common with Canada, with Britain. I'm not sure I don't know much about, I'm afraid, about war remembrance traditions in India or other former parts of the British Empire. But in any case, whenever we're thinking about these kind of questions, we need to consider how veterans who are telling their stories and remembering their experiences, how are they possibly influenced by the dominant form of war remembrance in our culture, in our society. And this tradition of war remembrance, and the rituals and the symbols associated with it, now includes Ortona. And the picture on the left is from a Canadian youth pilgrimage to the Canadian cemetery at Ortona from 2008. And on the right is a Canadian monument that's quite central in the town of Ortona, called the Price of Peace. And I'll talk more about that later in the presentation. And the point that I'll make here is that this tradition of war remembrance, it tends to elevate certain experiences of war and to emphasize certain types of soldiers' experience. And it tends to downplay or silence or just not really provide support for other types of experiences, for other types of stories. And it portrays veterans as having a particular way of remembering. I'll go back here. This, I should have said, is maybe it's obvious. It's a recruitment poster from World War I in Canada, drawing on the popularity of John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields already at the time during the war. So before we had war remembrance, we had some of the symbols and the discourses of remembrance right during the war itself. That's a line, if ye break faith, we shall not sleep. Probably everybody knows that's from In Flanders Fields. And the story of the poem In Flanders Fields is that John McCrae wrote it while he was, or shortly after, he was contemplating the graves of some of his recently killed comrades. And that's what we see in that poster as well. The Canadian soldier is looking down at the cross that marks the place of presumably one of his Canadian comrades. And so still today, I think, our war remembrance traditions around Remembrance Day portray veterans themselves as that's how they remember, that's what they remember. That we who are not veterans are supporting the veterans as they perform these rituals of remembrance to remember their comrades in that way. So that's our war remembrance provides a particular kind of iconic image of the war veteran and what and how the veteran remembers. And then we are remembering alongside the veteran. But that's like all memory and like all traditions. You can't have a tradition, you can't have a ritual that is not some kind of simplification. So that in itself is not really a criticism, but what we need to always be mindful of is that it's a simplification that will tend to leave out or exclude or make certain other stories that don't fit harder to tell. And another thing that makes stories hard to tell is what I mentioned earlier, when it's from a traumatic experience. And here I just thought I'd give a brief quote from one veteran I interviewed, but he wasn't really named Bill. He asked to remain anonymous. He was a Seaforth veteran of Ortona. And he told me early on in the interview so I'm trying to think of some stories, but most of them are not too nice, Ian, that's the thing. And his way of telling the stories was at first very confusing. And there were moments during the interview where I thought, maybe he's not, he's not making sense. And is he making stuff up? Is he, does he have some other kind of mental difficulties? But gradually I started to notice that it was adding up. And what was happening was, I don't think he had ever told this story before. And it was a very traumatic memory for him.
Yep.
If I had not stayed with him and spent maybe 4 hours with him and listening to him in his house, and if I had just been eager to get some historical evidence and then move on, then I would have cut that interview short politely. I would have maybe concluded that, okay, I don't think I'm going to get anything from this. I would have sort of wrapped it up politely and moved on. And so I also think about that veterans with Bill and with experiences like Bill, their stories rarely get told. And it's not necessarily because people are unwilling to listen or unwilling to hear, but it's because we don't always know how. And so and those tend to be experiences, especially, well, certainly in my case, in my research, what I found was that those stories that were most difficult to tell, like Bill's, were experiences related to killing. And so I brought in this quote from a professor of cultural history at the University of London, Joanna Burke, where she observes, the characteristic act of men at war is not dying, it's killing. But accounts of the experience of war prefer to stress the satisfaction of male bonding, discomforts, and the unspeakable terror of dying. Readers, now here, I see that this is debatable. This is what Joanna Burke sees. Readers of military history books might be excused for believing that combatants found in war zones were really there to be killed rather than to kill. I don't know if that's a fair description of military history, but I do think it's a fair point about our war commemoration traditions, which center on the fear of dying or the soldier's sacrifice, perhaps quite understandably, that what our countries, what our societies find most meaningful and most important to commemorate is the risk that soldiers took of their own lives and the ones who did lose their lives. What we tend to overlook, if all we knew was from Remembrance Day, from those traditions, then I think Joanna Burke has a valid point there, that it's maybe easy to forget that the soldiers were not there to die, to be killed. And certainly when they were training for combat and when they were in combat, they were very preoccupied with the job that I mentioned in my book. The general of the Canadian forces in Ortona, Chris Oakes, gave them a talk saying, the more Germans you kill, the quicker you're going to get home. They were given reminders that that's what you're here to do. And that didn't go away after the war. They remembered that. But there wasn't really a place for them to remember that and how they felt about that in their society when they came home. Okay, so now I thought I'd give an overview of the battle, but I'll try to move through this fairly quickly. And just maybe making some points that people haven't heard before from other readings or other presentations on Ortona. And then after this overview, I'll get back to the battle in popular memory, and then the story of that monument, the Price of Peace.
Yeah.
I put two maps on here just to make the point that map on the left is from the Canadian Army official history of the Italian campaign in World War II. The map on the right is a 16th or 17th century map of ancient Italy, which shows Ortona there on roughly the same coastline. And just to make the point that when we're talking about the Battle of Ortona, then we typically arrive, the story of Ortona begins when the British 8th Army gets there, when the Canadians get there. But of course, Ortona has its own history. And for the people of Ortona, that matters. Some paintings just to illustrate the geography surrounding Ortona. The one on the left is by Charles Comfort. That's looking at Ortona from the south. Looking at Ortona more or less from where the war cemetery is today. And the one on the right is looking at Ortona from the north. And that's by Lauren Harris. You see the castle there prominently in the painting on the right. That's a 14th century castle at the very tip of the point of the sort of escarpment that Ortona is built on. And here's another view of Ortona now from the from the sea. And a map of Ortona this is from my book, just to give a sense of the streets. The oldest part of Ortona is there in the northeast, and that's where the cathedral, San Tommaso, is located. The Canadians were approaching from the south. The church where the Seaforths had that dinner is down in the very bottom southeast corner.
Yeah.
And there are actually 3 churches in Ortona. Just sometimes people might get it mixed up what they're picturing in their minds. The church where the Seaforths had their dinner was Santa Maria di Costantinopoli. That was a rather small church that's illustrated there on the right. But I should try not to take up too much time talking about all the churches in Ortona. Thank you. That's what San Tommaso looked like before the war. And there you see the tower that has a clock in it. So that's what the versions that I've been told were of the Germans as they were preparing for the Canadian assault. They obviously wanted to deny the Canadians visual clues, targets. They wanted to create rubble piles for their machine gun positions. They wanted to create rubble to block the streets. Where the streets are wide enough for tanks, they wanted to fill those with rubble. So they were destroying a lot of things for those purposes. And as part of that, they blew up that tower, which then came down and took down the cathedral dome. Now, a bit about Ortona's way of life before the war. A major part of its economy was fishing. They also had shipbuilding, agriculture. It's sort of a classic Southern Italian economy. This is a picture from their festival of the grape. They had a very rich cultural life. This is from a annual street festival that they had, festival of music and dance in the streets. And tourism was a big part of the economy. The population of Ortona used to triple in the summer. And they had these nice views from what they call the Orientale. Now, then when we get to the battle, I don't know how much I need to explain here. I think most people know that at this stage in December 1943, the British 8th Army was aiming to, well, originally they, if I understand correctly, they thought they might get to Rome. Then that got scaled back to, well, we'll get to Pescara, which opens the road to Rome. The U.S. 5th Army was meanwhile on the other side of the Italian peninsula, fighting their way up from Naples. In the end, nobody got to Rome that winter. And the 8th Army assault stopped just short of Pescara. They were stopped by the fighting in Ortona. And the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was tasked with trying to get to Pescara from the Moro River. And so they were closest to the coast. And just inland from them was the 8th Indian Division. And then just further inland from the 8th Indian Division was the New Zealand Division. And I thought it's important to point that out, that it wasn't just the Canadians. And from a certain point of view, this was a unified attempt to get, well, from an objective point of view, this was a unified attempt to get to Pescara and open the road to Rome. And none of, every unit in the 8th Army contributed to that at this point in time. And on the other side, defending was the 1st German Parachute Division. I'm actually not sure, I've never thought of this, if the 1st Parachute Division was also fighting against the New Zealanders in, the New Zealand front was at a town called Ortona. And I just thought of that now, so I should be careful. I know for certain against the Canadians, what the Canadians and what the Indians were facing was the 1st Parachute Division. Someone
will jump in the sidebar and have the answer.
Yeah. And I wanted to include this photograph from around December, I think it's December 8th, by Canadian Army photographer Terry Rowe. These are German prisoners taken during the fighting for the Moro River. And most of the soldiers that you see to the left are Seaforth Highlanders of Vancouver. But there's one man there in a turban. And I think he has to be from the 8th Indian Division. Certainly nobody was wearing turbans in the Canadian Army at that time. So just to note that the Indian Division was fighting I think it was just 4 or 5 kilometers from the Canadians. And their fight for a town called Villa Grande down the road from Ortona was, some accounts that I've read have said that it was equally as tough fighting as what the Canadians experienced. I see a note that the New Zealanders were fighting the Fallschirmjäger, that's the paratroops, and the Panzer Grenadiers. Yes, and the Panzer Grenadiers come up in some of the Canadian fighting as well on the way to Ortona. What tends to be forgotten in Canadian popular memory of Ortona is that there was equally as much fighting in the countryside just to the west of Ortona as there was in the urban context. And I started wondering, I don't discuss this in the book actually, but I started wondering to myself, why is the urban battle more remembered? Because actually, in fact, in the countryside outside Ortona, the Canadian casualties were higher than in the urban battle. But the images and the stories that we hear of Ortona are mostly urban. And it might be because the relative uniqueness of the urban battle. There were not very many, and I think you know this better than I do, Paul, but I think there were not very many urban battles, certainly among the Allies.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
And so that's maybe one reason that this stands out. And so there, we've already seen that picture. Oh, I see Jason Drew. Yeah. Oh, and I'm going to mention your work, Jason, shortly. One thing I find kind of neat, just by the way, about this photo is how they drew a beaver on their tank. Do you see that under the blast away? Yeah. And something I haven't mentioned yet, anyone who's heard of Ortona has surely heard of it, is the house-to-house fighting. And what you see in this photo here is, I think these are Edmonton. So in the urban battle, the major regiments on the Canadian side were the Seaforth Highlanders of Vancouver and the Royal Edmonton Regiment, supported by the Three Rivers tank. And obviously this is a street that's already been cleared, or they would not be walking down it. So they, most of the fighting in Ortona after the first couple of days was house to house, and people have probably heard of the mouse holing technique, blasting through the walls, working their way through the streets, through the walls of the adjacent houses. And so I wonder sometimes, certainly in popular memory, the urban battle stands out more because of the distinctiveness, and maybe also because we have more pictures of it. And I don't know, is just something that I wonder about. Was there something about the nature of the urban fighting that made it stick in a certain way in the memories of the veterans, of the soldiers who did that fighting? I just don't know. Now, at the time of the battle, it was already being mythologized, right, while it was happening, by reporters, especially Matthew Halton of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that through his radio broadcasts to Canadians back home, he was narrating the battle in a certain way. And you'll often come across quotes from his broadcasts, like this one. An epic thing is happening amid the crumbling and burning walls of the compact town. For 7 days and 7 nights. Do you notice how that sounds kind of biblical? I mean, it's also true. It happens to be true. It was 7 days. But I think that's another reason that it kind of resonates, right? That it'll stick in people's minds. 7 days and 7 nights, the Canadians have been trying to clear the town, and the action is as fierce as modern man has ever fought. The sullen young zealots of a crack German parachute division have been defending like demons. The battle has the quality of a nightmare, like the fight at Stalingrad. It's often called the Little Stalingrad, or Canada's. Well, I don't know if it should be called Canada's Stalingrad, because we were not. That's which side of Stalingrad you think you're on there. But you see how it's being mythologized there, and there's certain things from Matthew Halton's reports that still come up that people repeat today, maybe not knowing that they're repeating Matthew Halton, like referring to the parachutists as crack.
Yep.
I always come across this, that the Canadians were up against these crack German troops. So Matthew Halton played a major role in not necessarily misrepresenting it, but in the ways that
introducing the style of language, in a sense. I mean, zealots and demons, two more kind of biblical, mythological references. He could have used a different choice, different words, and it would have taken it down a different meaning. It's profound.
Yeah. I mean, he was very eloquent. His son David Halton is also, I don't know if he is or if he's retired. He's probably retired, but his son David Halton was also a CBC broadcaster, and in a book that he wrote about his father, he quotes some of these passages, and he actually says maybe in some cases is a little bit melodramatic, but that's what his father was meant to do during the war. There was a purpose for his broadcasts, but that language has stuck around. And some of the veterans that I interviewed, they didn't intentionally or directly contradict Matthew Halton, but sometimes I put to them, like, would you say the Germans defended like demons? There's another passage where Matthew Halton says the Germans were demons, the Canadians fought like demons, or something to that effect. And one of the veterans, like Bill, who I quoted earlier anonymously, he kind of turned away from that. He said, well, the Germans killed us and we killed them. Anyway, that was sort of part of the mythologization of Ortona at the time, and that still is with us today. And I think, I think it's fair to say that certainly a major reason that Ortona is strongly remembered now is the fact that it was fought through Christmas. And I think that made a difference to the soldiers who were fighting it as well. Even, many of them told me that they didn't think that much about Christmas at the time, but they thought about it afterwards. And I think that we have with us, certainly it's something that is part of the British memory of World War I, and I think it sticks with Canadians as well, is that idea of the Christmas truce. Yeah. Right. And so in Ortona, there was
a lot of rubbish has been said, as long as a lot of amazing analysis. It's sparked a whole subfield of in some cases dodgy history and revisionist, but a fascinating story at its core.
I don't know much about that, but I have a sense of that. I think somewhere I've come across, like that Christmas truce is maybe not as much as how
it's the football element that's mostly been overblown, but we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, that's another popular memory story. But I think that's pertinent to the way that Ortona gets remembered and talked about. And what I have here, we've already talked about the debates around that photograph. But you see how even I use it. It's like we need to have an image, because that Christmas dinner that the C4s organized is so important to people, and it's so it's such a compelling, poignant story that it just seems that we need to have an image to go along with it. So even I find myself sticking that photo in when I want to talk about it. It's in my book as well. And here we have a Christmas broadcast from Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Mackenzie King, addressing the troops on that day that they were fighting Christmas Day in Ortona. At Christmas season, you have reason to rejoice that you're fighting to preserve the spirit of Christmas itself, King said to the troops. Now, how many of them were listening to that is another question. But it's something that was on some of their minds. Like, what does this mean, that I'm fighting on Christmas Day? And then the fact that it's an urban battle, and it's an urban battle in Italy. You know, you get a town the size of Ortona is just 10,000 people, and they have a huge cathedral, and that's still not the only church. Like, you go a few blocks and there's another church. So was there something about that had an effect on the experience of that battle for the soldiers who fought it? And fighting inside people's homes. This is now I don't know if the photo itself was staged, but this is a photo taken by an army photographer that last week of December in Ortona of an Edmonton soldier ready to shoot through a window. And if you're able to look closely, you can see the calendar on the wall. And it's one of those calendars where you tear a page off, or you change the page to get the date. And the date there is December 18th. So somebody left on December 18th. But you're fighting among people's furniture, photographs, mirrors, and so on. What is it like to do that? And then to see these cross sections of homes, these domestic spaces. And then when the fighting was over, when the Germans withdrew from Ortona on December 28th, then suddenly all these civilians emerged. Now, the veterans who I interviewed all told me that well, maybe there were one or two exceptions, but the majority of them, they said they did not see civilians during the battle, and that they weren't aware that civilians were in the town. Civilians were hiding in basements and in the hospital, and just hiding out in different parts of Ortona. It would take me too long to explain. What the Germans tried to remove civilians, but some of them did move out into the countryside. Some of them thought it would be better to hide in the town rather than going to the countryside. Some of them went to the countryside when the Germans kicked them out, but then the countryside was getting bombed too. So many of the ones that were refugees in the countryside made the decision to go back into the town. In any case, when the battle was over, suddenly all these civilians came out. And that was part of the Canadian experience as well. You know, suddenly maybe being reminded that these were homes that we were fighting in that have just been destroyed. Now, that postcard that I shared earlier, just to illustrate Ortona's economy before the war and how it was a major tourist town, that's actually a postcard that was brought back to Edmonton by a veteran named Stan Chetelbro. And some of you might have noticed when I first shared the photograph, there's an X marked on it. So I thought I'd show you what's on the back of this postcard. And what it says there is, I stayed in the rooms that are marked after Ortona fell, December 1943 and January 1944. That's a note made by Stan Chetelbro. and he marked an X. When the battle was over, the Canadians collected postcards which had been blown all over the streets, and many of them brought them back as souvenirs. And so that's what this one is. And as Stan Chetelborough says there, well, he says he stayed for December and January. The whole 1st Canadian Division stayed in Ortona or the vicinity. They were billeted there until April 44, when they moved to the other front. For well, Canada, it's the battle for the Leary Valley. Others know it as Monte Cassino. So, and now there's a Commonwealth War Cemetery outside Ortona. That's the Morrow River Canadian War Cemetery. And there's a total of 1,615 Commonwealth troops there. Just over 1,300 of them are Canadian. That includes all the casualties of the Morrow River campaign, leading up to and including the urban battle. And the German figures are a bit tricky. I have figures here for the urban battle. For the Canadians, there were 108 killed, 191 wounded. For the Germans, 68 killed, but 205 missing. And I think it was actually Jason Drew and Lee Windsor pointed out that most of those German missing were probably killed. That they were left behind, and it was the Canadians who buried them. The Germans, incidentally, were originally buried in Ortona's civilian cemetery. And then sometime in the 1950s, they were moved to the German War Cemetery at Cassino. And of the Italian civilians, their casualty count, but this includes from September 1943 until the spring of 1944. But their casualty count is 1,314 killed. Now, the parish priest of Ortona estimated that, and he made a record of the names and ages. He estimated that in the urban battle of Ortona, there were 188 killed in the urban battle during that 1 week. So the Italian count includes people who died even months after the battle, because they touched a booby trap or stepped on a mine while they were walking in the fields, and so on. A few more postcards from Ortona. How it was rebuilt after the war. San Tommaso, not nearly as nice and elegant as it was before. That was what they could afford to do in Italy in the 1950s. A lot of people from Ortona emigrated after the war because there was so much destruction and hard to make a living. Many of them came to Canada, actually. And now I thought I would share, and this is a way of sharing both if somebody wants to read a bit more about the battle, and also a way of talking about sort of moving into how the battle's been remembered in the decades after. That many people might not know. I think Farley Mowat is well known outside Canada. Is that true? Are you familiar with
He's becoming better known. I mean, people like Norma in the sidebar is always promoting his work, and I know you're mentioning Mark Zelke later on. So I think he's starting to get known. But I think people are knowing him via being referenced in other people's more modern books, and more so than his own books. But they are being discovered. Yeah, but yeah.
So he's most known also in Canada for his writing on the Canadian North, wilderness stories, and stories about his dog, childhood. Right? But he was a lieutenant in a rifle platoon at Ortona. He was in the not in the urban battle though. So he was in the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment which fought in the countryside outside Ortona. And in his memoir of the war, called And No Birds Sang, his memoir ends at Ortona. It ends with his mental breakdown during the fighting in the countryside. And then he was taken out of combat. He was given a non-combat role for the duration of the rest of the war. And while he was billeted in Ortona or outside Ortona that winter, 1944, that's where he finished the draft of his famous book about his dog, The Dog Who Wouldn't Be. Not many Canadians know this. So that's a little story about the legacy of Ortona. I've seen letters in his archives where he mentions late in his life that memories of Ortona were still coming back to him. Although he went back in the 1950s and found it so troubling to be there again that he resolved never to go back again, and he never did. And I'm actually I'm doing some research now. I'm writing some essays about Farley Mowat in Ortona. But anyway, if someone wants to read more about Ortona, there's Mowat's memoir is a very good place to start. But that's a literary memoir, and some people argue that Mowat got a few things wrong, or he might have been. There's the same issues that come up with memory, but I would say there's a lot of emotional truth, at least, in Mowat's story. And here you mentioned Mark Zelke. This is the definitive book-length work on the battle, and Mark Zelke covers the urban battle and the rural, sort of the complete Battle of Ortona for the entire, from the Moro River up to the conclusion of December. And I would say that Zelke's book played a major role in bringing the battle to prominence in Canadian public memory. I'd say there were two key contributions, and one of them was Mark Zelke, and I'll get to the other one shortly. And around the same time, interestingly, late 1990s. I saw that Jason Drew is here, and I would highly recommend anyone interested to go have a look at Jason's MA thesis. Jason also co-authored with his thesis supervisor, Lee Windsor, an article that I found really useful in that volume, Urban Battlefields. Thanks, Jason. Yeah. And so, like I mentioned earlier on my Substack later, I'll provide links to all of this material, and that volume, Urban Battlefields, might be hard to find for some people in some parts of the world, but anybody can go online and find Jason's MA thesis. So that's, I think that's really key work on the urban battle. There's also, I'm sure you know, James Holland. I think he's been on your show, Paul.
Yeah, he has. Yeah, good friend. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, and so he's a good source for Ortona in the full context of the Italian campaign, and he includes civilian stories and more of the German stories as well. He actually concludes this book, The Savage Storm, with the monument, The Price of Peace, in Ortona. Something that is not very well known is this book, 1943, The Road to Ortona, by Saverio Di Tullio. Saverio, he passed away just recently, I think just last year. He's a historian and graphic artist in Ortona. And he originally wrote this in Italian and then had it translated into English. This is a graphic history of the battle from the civilian point of view. And so the scene here is the celebrations in Ortona when there was the coup in Rome during the invasion of Sicily and Mussolini was deposed, for example. And then here's part of the story when they were under bombardment when the war came to Ortona. And so this is a graphic history that includes the Canadian and the German, sort of a mix of the military history and also the civilian stories of Ortona. It's also important to mention that the work of translation here was done by Angela Arnone, who some of your audience might know, or I don't know if you've heard of her, Paul, but Angela Arnone plays a prominent role in war remembrance and Canadian pilgrimages and battlefield tours to Ortona.
Okay.
She also helped Saverio Di Tullio with some of his research for this book. And finally, this is a novel by Canadian novelist Leslie Kruger, Far Creek Road. And the main character in this novel, the novel is set in suburban Vancouver in the 1960s. The main character is a girl growing up whose father is an Ortona veteran. And so this novel, you won't learn about the battle, so to speak, if you read this novel, but you'll learn something. It's based on Leslie's own childhood growing up, where her father had served in the Loyal Edmonton Regiment in the Italian campaign. And when Leslie was a girl, her father sort of confused her sometimes because of these dark moods that he would enter, and especially around Christmas. And he would sort of retreat. I think she told me he would retreat to the garage for days. And he never talked about it. But what Leslie's mother told her was it's because of Ortona. And so that's an example. There were many children like Leslie, I think, growing up where Ortona for them was a word. And it was a word that somehow explained but didn't really explain what they experienced from their fathers or women with their husbands and so on. So the legacy of that is a story that's partly told through novels like this one. Okay, so getting now to how Ortona came to prominence, that starting in the 1990s. Up until then, for most Canadians, either never heard of Ortona or it was a word that was heard, like in Leslie Kruger's case. But now in Ortona, there's this monument, there's pilgrimages. How did we get from there to here? An example of how Ortona has become a touch point for Canadians. This is from the Substack of a former politician in Canada named Charlie Angus, The Legacy of Ortona. People might agree or disagree with Charlie's politics, but he has a very popular Substack. He's got about 250,000 subscribers. When he retired from politics, he started this Substack, which he calls The Resistance. So it's about sort of defending Canada from, basically from, when Donald Trump started talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. That fired up a lot of Canadians like Charlie. And it's in that context that Charlie wrote this one post where he's reflecting on his visit to Ortona, called The Legacy of Ortona, Remembering the Real Price of Peace. And he writes, "Fascism is on the move, and Canada is once again on the front line in the fight for democracy. All of us have been called up for active duty. We need to invoke the spirit of our ancestors who freed the world from tyranny. This is why I keep thinking of the statue at Ortona." So that's just an example of how Ortona is starting to come up in various contexts.
And just as a single word, I mean, I don't know what the context is, what he said in the next paragraph, but he didn't say the Battle of Ortona, or Ortona, that famous battle from 1943. He assumed that the word on its own would be enough to convey what he's trying to get across.
Well, actually, no. It's not safe to. So Ortona is not that well known, right?
Okay.
I should clarify. So if you talk to Canadians and you mention D-Day, right, or Normandy, they might not have heard it referred to as Overlord or something. But pretty much everybody in Canada has some idea of what D-Day is. There would be lots of Canadians who don't necessarily know what you're talking about when you mention Ortona. They still need some context. But it's become well known enough that you can write things like this. So in this post, I'll share a link to this also when I share my sources. Charlie does say a bit about the battle. But what's interesting to me is how he's using the battle as a kind of a rallying cry today. He's saying, like, we fought a tough battle against some of the best German troops in December 1943. We can do it again. Right? Is sort of the gist of it. Right? And that monument in Ortona, that what he calls the statue, is a symbol for us, or it's sort of the focal point. It's become the focal point of the memory. It's a visual icon of Ortona for Canadians. Now here is that price of peace. I think it's more correctly called a monument. It's often called a statue as well. And you see there's two figures in it. One crouched over, the other who's prone. And there you can see a bit better. So this is representing two Canadian soldiers, one who's clearly been wounded, possibly shot dead, and the other one who's trying to comfort him or trying to help him. It's meant to capture a moment in the midst of battle. Now, that monument is often represented, often talked about, without remembering how it got there. And so the story of how that Price of Peace monument got created and how it got to Ortona is also a story of how Ortona became more prominent in Canadian popular memory. So this is where, on one hand, there's Mark Zelke's book, which was a national bestseller. I think it was published in 1999. And the other key factor is the story of Ted Griffiths and the 1998 reconciliation that Ted Griffiths organized. So Ted, or his full name Edmund, went by Ted Griffiths. He was, I think he was a lieutenant in the Three Rivers Tank Regiment in Ortona. I think I got that right. Well, he was definitely in the Three Rivers Tanks. And in 1998, he organized a trip to Ortona for Christmas by a group of Canadian veterans, and they invited the Germans to join them for Christmas. Now, what Ted said was motivating him to do this was his own troubled memories of Christmas in Ortona. In the fighting, he remembered destroying a church. And something that he said about that was what I quote here: "The fact that it was Christmas just didn't enter my mind at that time. But when you survive a battle and you begin to think back at what transpired, this is when the ghosts arrive. And it is the ghosts of Ortona, it is the ghost of that church that keep coming back to haunt you." That's where I got the title for my book. And Ted, it sounds like he was similar to Leslie Kruger's father. The story that Leslie told me about her father going into a kind of a dark mood and retreating from Christmas. Ted said that he did the same, that after Ortona, Christmas was never the same again. that he could never enjoy Christmas. And so part of what was motivating him to organize this 1998 Christmas, what he called the Christmas reconciliation, was that he wanted to be able to enjoy Christmas again. And he decided that in order to do that, he needed to celebrate it with the Germans. Now, he said that he got the inspiration from that from his chaplain, Joseph Wilhelm, of the Three Rivers Regiment. And this is actually a portrait of Wilhelm that was painted by Lauren Harris in Ortona in February 1944. And Ted told the story that I think it would have been sometime in the early 1990s. But anyway, he said at a certain reunion of the Three Rivers Regiment, he was talking with his chaplain, Wilhelm, and they were talking about Christmas in Ortona, and they were talking about how the Seaforths had that dinner during the battle. And Wilhelm said to him, you know what, someday we should go back there and we should do it again, and this time do it with the Germans. And then Wilhelm passed away shortly after that. And Ted credited Wilhelm with the inspiration for that idea. So then Ted tried to get funding, because he said that he wanted to put together a group of Ortona veterans of about 30 Canadians that would hopefully meet up with 30 Germans. And they would go back to Ortona for Christmas Day, and they would celebrate Christmas in the church, and they would have a dinner together as well. He went to veterans, well, he wrote to, in Canada, the ministry responsible for war veterans is called Veterans Affairs. He approached them for funding to support the trip. They replied that they couldn't support that. It was sort of outside of their mandate and their budget. They said, why don't you, we've got a pilgrimage scheduled for next year to commemorate, to go to all the battlefields and the cemeteries. You can just go on that. And Ted said, but that's not the point, right? The point is to be there for Christmas and to invite the Germans. And so when he couldn't get the funding from Veterans Affairs, he went to the media, and someone who deserves some credit for making this happen is a politician named Peter Goldring, who was in the opposition, not in government. And he had the idea to do a media campaign and a fundraising campaign. So long story short, I tried to cover this as well as I could in my book, but I need to cut things a little short here. But Peter Goldring played an important role in making this happen. They did, through public fundraising campaign, they were able to get enough money to send 30 Canadian veterans to Ortona for 1 week, that Christmas week. On the German side, in the end, only 6 Germans came. There's a story that I don't know very well. I'm sure it's a story that could be told about World War II memory in Germany. I imagine it would not be so easy to do a fundraising campaign in Germany to send 30 of their parachute veterans to Ortona. But 6 of the parachute veterans responded to the invitation, and they were there in Ortona for the last week of December 1998. Pictured there on the left is German parachute veteran Willy Fretz. By the way, one of the German veterans who was there for that event, you can read about in James Holland's book, named Joseph or Jupp Klein. I've noticed that James Holland interviewed Klein and quotes extensively from him in his books, but they don't mention this event. But Klein was there for that, and apparently became quite good friends with Ted Griffiths. So the key, the high point of that 1 week reconciliation was celebrating Christmas Eve in that church in Ortona, and then having a dinner together This is a photograph from that dinner. There's much that could be said, which I don't have time for, in terms of other events during that reconciliation, and what it meant, or questions of what it meant to the various participants. For now, I'll just keep the focus on that Price of Peace statue, because this is where it comes in. You can't really see it in this photo, but in the upper left, there is a little table with a Canadian flag on it, and that's the model of that Price of Peace statue. What happened was, when Ted and Peter Goldring were doing the public fundraising campaign in fall of 1998, can we get enough public support that we can make this event happen, that we can go to Ortona for Christmas and meet the Germans? There was an artist, an Ottawa artist named Rob Surette, who approached Ted, said that he wanted to make a monument to go along with the way that he wanted to support this was that he could create a monument or a statue that they could put in Ortona. So that's the origins of that. And at the time of the reconciliation event, they had a model that they unveiled. Then the full-scale sculpture or statue was then created, and Ted wanted to find a place for that in Ortona. But then he encountered some difficulty, and the difficulty was that the municipal government in Ortona just wasn't responding to him. And it got to the point, he writes in his memoir, it got to the point where he thought that for whatever reason, Ortona was just not going to accept, or at least the government of Ortona was just not interested, did not want this statue. And he approached the director of the Canadian War Museum at the time, Jack Granitstein, to say, well, would you take this if I can't get it to Ortona? He was starting to think that you can have anywhere to put this monument. Now, this is an area where I would like to do more research and find out more of what was happening. But some of the things that I was told when I was in Ortona about that delay and the difficulty that Ted was having was that the mayor and some members of Ortona's council at the time represented the political party called Alleanza Nazionale. That's a party that derives from the neo-fascist Movimento Sociale Italiano, or Italian social movement, which derives from the fascist Italian Social Republic. The Italian Social Republic, which also went by people might know it as the Salo Republic. That's basically the puppet regime that Mussolini created when he was liberated by the German parachutists. When there was the coup in Italy, and then when the new Italian government signed the armistice with the Allies in September '43, then the Germans promptly invaded and took over as much of Italy as they could, and they liberated Mussolini from captivity, and they installed Mussolini as the leader of a new state called the Italian Social Republic. After the war, some of the leaders and officers in that Italian Social Republic formed a political party called the MSI, neo-fascist. In the 1990s, the MSI reformed itself, or they said they reformed themselves. They said, we're not neo-fascists anymore, we're post-fascists. What they said was, we don't disown fascism, but we're post-fascist in the sense that we want to draw what remains valuable or legitimate, and just leave behind what's not. And the icon of that new post-fascist party, what they did, they just took that MSI icon and they put it in a larger circle with a different color in Alleanza Nazionale. This was very controversial in Italy at the time. what does it mean to be post-fascist?
Mm.
How does this relate to the way that we want to, because the Alleanza Nazionale was challenging the dominant Italian national narrative of the war, which was that they celebrate in Italy every April the liberation of Italy, with the prominent role. Of course, they emphasized the role played by the partisans, by the anti-fascist resistance in Italy. The Alleanza Nazionale was saying, let's just put all that behind us. Fascist, anti-fascist, they were all more or less, everybody thought they were fighting for the right thing, and let's just stop dwelling on that. So one explanation that I was told by some people in Ortona was that when Ted Griffiths and other veterans were trying to place that Canadian monument in Ortona, the Price of Peace, which very vividly represents the sacrifice of a Canadian soldier, that was uncomfortable for some of the leading members of Ortona's municipal government. It was sort of messing with what they wanted to put behind. Or explicitly reminding them of people who they fought against. Incidentally, there were some Italians fighting with the Germans against the Canadians in Ortona. That's another story. Soldiers of the Repubblica Sociale Italiana.
Mm.
So that's one explanation that I was given. Another possibility that I thought of was that did some people in Ortona necessarily want to have a monument depicting a soldier, like a dying soldier or a wounded soldier, or depicting something violent in the midst of their town, in the center of their town? It's like Ted Griffiths wanted this monument to be placed in a central square in Ortona. But a central square is where people go about their daily lives. Like in that photograph, you see somebody carrying maybe some of the groceries or something. I think it's one thing for Canadians to make a pilgrimage to see a monument and then leave. But we should also consider that, what's it like if that's outside your balcony every day? Another factor could be the civilian monument to civilian casualties in Ortona is placed at their cemetery on the outskirts of town. This is a monument that was built and installed in the 1960s, I think 1965. Interestingly, they call it Monument to Civilian Victims of War. They didn't specify that it's just a monument to themselves, to their own people. But when they created this and installed it in the 1960s, they gave it a name. They wanted it to have a meaning for all civilian casualties of war. Now, originally they put this, I'll show you two close-ups. It's by a local artist, either Tommaso or Basilio Cascella. This was originally in front of the reconstructed San Tommaso Cathedral in the center of town. Then at some point in the 1980s, they moved it out of the center of town to the outskirts, to their municipal cemetery. And so again, I just have to wonder that, if they were thinking that that's where they moved their civilian monument, then where should they put a monument to the Canadians? And finally, something that has to be considered is that no longer today, I think today in Ortona, there would still be some people alive today who experienced the battle as children. Most of them passed away now. But for the ones who did, especially in the 1990s, early 2000s, these were traumatic memories. For example, Luisa Di Luzio, who I mentioned earlier, whose father was killed during the fighting. And so I wonder, Yeah, I wish I had thought at the time of my research when I could have still talked to them. How did they feel about the placement of the monument? Anyways, just to say that there's sensitivities around these things. It's not necessarily that these were post-fascist government that that had troubled them. It might have also been the municipal government might have also been trying to consider and take more time to consider the feelings of the people in the town. If they wanted this monument, where should it be? But it did get placed in a central square, thanks to the intervention of the Italian embassy in Canada. They contacted the government in Rome, contacted the municipal government, said you need to stop stalling, get this monument a place in town. I don't know the full story of that, but that's the version that Ted tells in his memoir.
Okay.
How it finally happened. And I also want to balance what I just said with the point that there were many, many Italians in Ortona who had very good, positive memories of the Canadians and who strongly supported the monument, who were very glad to have it. So that was unveiled in October 1999.
Mm-hmm.
That's an image from the local Ortona media of the unveiling ceremony. Now, I'll just wrap up here with an observation and a brief story related to the monument. The observation is, if you think about, well, first looking at the monument and what it depicts, you might notice that it's the same kind of thing as the In Flanders Fields story. There's a wounded or dying or already dead comrade, and the other soldier who's witnessing that, trying to help him, comfort him, and presumably that's something that soldier is going to remember later on. He's going to think about that on a Remembrance Day and so on. Anyway, so that's sort of like the monument captures what's already iconic in Canadian war remembrance. But that monument would not exist if it weren't for Ted Griffiths and the other Canadian veterans who organized that reconciliation dinner with the Germans. Now, that origin story tends to be forgotten or left out. Like if you go to the Veterans Affairs Canada page about the monument, they say it was unveiled to commemorate the sacrifices and achievements of our soldiers during the Battle of Ortona. It was commissioned by a group of Canadian veterans who held a special reunion in 1998 in the town. What was special about that reunion was they wanted to do it with the Germans. I wonder why that can't be mentioned in the story.
Yeah.
And lastly, there's this story of Ortona veteran Morris White, who was at the unveiling of the monument. And when I talked to him, he started out by telling me, and he gave me this photo of himself at the monument. And he said that the pilgrimage, referring to the pilgrimage for the installation of the monument, makes me feel that everything's complete now. I don't feel like I have to return to whatever it was that was left behind in Ortona. He always felt that he'd left something behind there, that he needed to go back to find it. And now he didn't feel that anymore after going there and being with the monument. Well, but there's another side to Morris's own story, where later in the same interview, he mentioned to me Christmas Day in Ortona. The one thing that got me was shooting a guy on Christmas Day. When I saw him, he fell, and two German soldiers, Morris was up, he was sniping. He was sniping from the the attic of a house. When I shot him, he fell, and 2 German soldiers came out and grabbed him, and I didn't shoot back. I thank God that I didn't. He shot one guy, and then he saw the others coming to get him, and he hesitated and decided not to shoot those guys. And then later in the same interview, he told me, that was in a square. I was up in the eave of a house, and I found that house the last time I was in Ortona. That, referring to that trip, October 1999. I tried 5 years ago and I couldn't find it, but this time I found it. And so that feeling that Morris had, that he'd achieved some kind of reconciliation or some kind of peace from that trip, was it the monument, the public monument, or was it his own private? You could think of that as almost a sort of private act of remembrance that he did by himself.
Yeah.
That he almost didn't even think to tell anybody else. Or maybe was he reluctant to tell anybody else about that? And it's not something that he could really share or monumentalize. I would say it was probably both.
Yeah.
But only one of those experiences is captured in the monument. But then I wonder, how would we capture that other important memory that Morris White had of, he felt that he had killed someone on Christmas Day. And that troubled him, and there was something that he wanted to do about that. He wanted to sort of just show some, not necessarily that the war was wrong, that the cause was wrong, that he shouldn't have been, but just something to sort of show some kind of, I don't know how Morris would want to put that, but just show that he was not indifferent to that. It was important enough to him that he wanted to find that place again. That's a hard thing to represent in our war commemoration. I don't know what a monument to that would look like, or if you even should make a monument to that.
Yeah.
But it's something that that isn't there. And Ortona's not unique this way, but if you go to Ortona today, you won't find anything that helps you to remember experiences like Morris White's or like Ted Griffiths or those particular experiences, memories that they had. There's nothing that reminds you of that or helps you. Unlike the monument that's there now. And I share this now just to show that where that Price of Peace monument, which was installed in 1999, since then, just a few years ago, I agree, Jason, that's a fantastic photo. I'll give the credit to that photo. It's not me. I think it's a local photographer in Ortona, and I'll give them credit on my Substack. But that's what that square looks like today. They've renamed the square Canadian Heroes Square. And I agree that that's beautiful work that they've done. But that's basically that's the theme of my work and the book, is these memories of Ortona veterans that were difficult to share, and it's sort of a dilemma of war. What do we do with those types of experiences, and can we even commemorate them?
Well, I mean, thank you for an absolutely blinding presentation, but you're putting into words thoughts I have kind of on a daily basis. In Normandy every June we have what's the appropriate language? Commemoration, remembrance. Can you celebrate D-Day? Can you celebrate the liberation?
Yeah.
You can't celebrate the deaths, but how we use the different words, the different contexts is very important. And I see it when I see, for example, a memorial in a town square in Normandy. It affects me differently on a day when there's nothing going on in the square than perhaps the day I go there and it's market day and there's someone selling fish and cheese around the memorial. I see it a different way there. And it doesn't bother me that it sees it a different way. And it doesn't bother me that the square has different uses, and on market day, you might get someone kind of squeezing through the stalls to lay a wreath at the memorial. And they're not bothered by the market being there. In some ways, you could say it enhances the experience. And for people like Paul Reed in the sidebar and myself who've taken veterans, when a journalist or something speaks to a veteran saying, "Why are you coming back to this battlefield?" As if there is a single response to that question, because clearly for most of them it has all sorts of. I mean, I knew one particular veteran who's, I hate going back to the battlefields. I absolutely hate it. I go because it's a duty. If I didn't, I would hate myself more for not going. And others who say, I love it. I love it. I don't think about the death. I enjoy meeting my mates and having beers. And somewhere it's probably a combination of those. And with other things, as you've made it clear, we can't even articulate, those of us that weren't there. And the way you've tied this into Christmas and the symbolism of the city and the church, and I mean, when you were showing those, the paintings also reminded me of Jerusalem. Not that I've been to Jerusalem, but if you're a Canadian soldier or a British soldier and you go to somewhere like Ortona, it's probably how you would imagine almost the biblical city would have looked. Because it's stone and it's narrow streets, and that's going to add a whole level of complexity to this. As you say, add the fact you're seeing religious statues, add the fact it's near Christmas. Church towers. There's a lot to unpack. Is the classic response to this, and I'm assuming that you don't. There's when someone has done, for example, a conventional military history book, they might think at the end of it, well, actually, I've exhausted every source there is. I've used all the diaries. I'm pretty certain my maps are okay. I'm pretty certain I know which corner first battalion turned left at. That's kind of done. But something like this, I'm assuming it's going to stay with you forever. And I'm remembering what you said right at the beginning about you took a break for it for a while after the PhD. This is now in your veins, as it is the veins of those guys and the civilians who went through it.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, I not say that that compare myself to the Ortona veterans, but I found when I was writing the book, I was thinking about the ambivalence I felt. Like, do I really want to write this book? And like, there's some days that I really want to, but kind of like what you said about the veterans returning to the battlefields, and sometimes they're like, it's not like I enjoy doing this, but I would feel worse about myself if I didn't. Sometimes that's what I felt about writing the book. I thought, I really struggled with this topic. It was really hard. It's about traumatic memories. I did not expect that when I was going into the research, somewhat naively, right? I thought it would be like I'd be studying popular memories of battle from different points of view. And anyway, I had my own experience of not wanting to live with this, wanting to put it behind me, but at the same time feeling worse about myself for not doing anything with it, for not writing this darn book. And I had a moment when I was writing the book when it suddenly struck me that maybe what I'm feeling about this is a little bit like what some of these guys felt about telling the stories. Like, did they really want these to be their stories? Is that how they feel about telling them? They told them because they felt it was important. That was, like what you just said there, Paul, that was something that I thought about, and it came to me, it really hit me when I was writing it.
And in a way, it's in some ways more complicated for descendants of veterans going back to battlefields, because they haven't got the connection in the first place directly. They're going there. It's a second-hand experience or third-hand experience, and yet they still want to. And Paul Reed again in the sidebar, who takes back all these people on tours now, and it's gone from the veterans and their kids to now great grandkids and great grandkids, and they've got to find meaning about visiting somewhere like Ortona, but they're not going back to it. They're going to it for the first time, but they perhaps know that they had a relative whom it was very important. So it's the visiting of battlefields is, it is about standing there and saying, yes, they came out of that tree line towards that hill over there. And there's a lot of, not pleasure necessarily, but a lot of, it's rewards to having that experience. But there's also a depth of understanding, the classic, what would I have done in these situations? And thank God my generation didn't have to do this. And although people like Jason have had to do this in various more modern experiences. So as I said at the beginning of this, I knew I'd have lots of thoughts buzzing through my head at the end of this. So we will bring things to an end. I will hold up my copy of the book there again, folks. The links to it are in the description below, and you can see the book is going to bring you a very nuanced, in-depth look at the battle, but the legacy of the battle, which is what we said it was going to do. So, Ian, it's been delightful talking to you. And folks, we're back to talk about rubber as a commodity tomorrow, we're going to logistics again tomorrow. Looking forward to that one. I found Alexander Field, who is probably the world's expert on rubber in World War II. So looking forward to that. We've done oil, we've done opium, we've done hemp. We're looking at rubber tomorrow. So thank you, Ian. Thank you, viewers. Please, if you've watched this and haven't subscribed yet, do subscribe. I'm now 400 and something away from reaching that magical 100,000 subscribers. I'm closing in on it. I'm closing in. So please do remember to hit that button and subscribe. Anyway, thanks, Ian. Thanks, viewers. I will see you all again tomorrow. Bye.
Okay.